Welcome to Engineered for Impact, a podcast helping engineers learn and think more about how they can have a positive social impact with their careers. In this episode, I talk to Gavriel Kleinwax, the Strategic Projects Lead at One Day Sooner. Gavriel's recent work has focused on how we can improve indoor air quality to reduce pathogen transmission. We discuss how Gavriel developed an interest in policy and how her interest in human challenge trials led to her working at One Day Sooner. We discuss how COVID challenge trials led to One Day Sooner investigating ways to improve indoor air quality. Gavriel provides an overview of the state of the field and interventions to improve indoor air quality, such as HVAC, air filtration, and air sterilization. And finally, we discuss how engineers can best contribute to and enter the field. You'll find show notes with resources related to this episode at engineeredforimpact.show/Gavriel. That's Gavriel. If you enjoy this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague. And without further ado, here's Gavriel.
My name is Gavriel Kleinwax. I am the Strategic Projects Lead at One Day Sooner, which is a project management role. One Day Sooner itself is an organization that was founded to represent the voices and values of volunteers in biomedical clinical trials, particularly vaccine challenge trials. It was founded at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. But my central focus for the last year and a half has been indoor air quality, which is a little bit further removed from many of our projects. So it's an interesting path.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting path. I'm kind of curious how you ended up starting at One Day Sooner, because you did a Bachelor of Science and then went on to doing a Master's in Mechanical Engineering and did some research after that. So are you able to sort of take me through the journey of from studying to ending up at One Day Sooner and then becoming the Strategic Projects Lead?
Yeah, of course. So I will say off the bat, it was very serendipitous. I have had students ask me how I got into, the sort of global health and biosecurity world. And I always feel a little bad that I can't tell them something replicable, right? I do not have like a particularly replicable route. So basically, I was deeply fascinated by physics, my first love, and studied physics in undergrad, and then wanted to do something more sort of applied, hands-on in graduate school. And so I started studying mechanical engineering and was working in a lab, a mechanical engineering research lab. I was still deeply fascinated by the fundamentals, by just learning about physics and how everything worked in the lab. It was very, very interesting. But at that time, I was beginning to get more interested in policy. I, kind of had found that I was a people person, right? And very motivated to work on things that would address sort of major issues around policy and, saw a route to impact through policies that help people live better lives. The academic research was really like a silo. And so although it was interesting, I was already beginning to think about, about a route into policy. So if you get a PhD, you can go into the AAAS. You can apply for the AAAS fellowship if you're in the US. It's a fellowship to get experienced researchers into the U.S. government. Although, to be totally honest, I don't remember what it stands for. But it's a very famous fellowship. So I was working in this research lab. I was working on soft robotics, and what that is robotic components made of soft materials. Super, super interesting. I will say up front, I have never been top of my class in the physical sciences. I was not a particularly excellent engineer. And I think when you're considering, impact as part of a motivation, um, it is something that is both a little impractical, maybe, to want to achieve that through a physical sciences path, but also it doesn't feel very good to know that you're not doing particularly well, right? Or I should say that you're very average.
In terms of the impact or in terms of
In terms
something
of
else?
being a researcher, yeah. Um, so academic research is also a fairly unique environment. The level of, solitary work and the level of um, like finagling tiny little details that are not particularly inspiring to adjust day after day after day. Um, so there was already sort of some of that going on in the background, but I really wanted. I had at that point thought, it made the most sense for me to, pursue the PhD after my master's degree. Then, so I was still in graduate school when the pandemic hit. The labs were shut down. And on top of that, my advisor moved to Germany. I was living in Colorado. He got an amazing job offer. I don't blame him. But he moved to Germany. And the choice was sort of for people to continue in the lab. They had to move to his new lab in Germany. Or I, maybe could have found another advisor, but the thought of starting over was deeply frustrating. And at that point, I honestly, I was pretty demoralized with being shut out of the lab. It was a bad time for a lot of people, of course. I wasn't talking to people. I wasn't socializing. I was getting, no feedback on my work. I couldn't do most of my work. But then even when we were permitted back into the lab in ones and twos, um, it was a very, um, you know, like demotivating environment to be in with so little interaction and feedback. And really, I'm very driven by feeling that other people care about my work, right? I'm very, very motivated when I know that other people like care about what I'm doing and, are um, working with me toward a shared goal, and like each of us like sort of needs to get our piece done, but you have to like put the pieces together. And as it happened, I was on a project where, each person had a separate piece, and I just didn't feel like I had that motivation. So simultaneously, back in, I want to say April of 2020, maybe very early in the pandemic, One Day Sooner was founded, and I saw a social media post from Rob Wiblin advertising One Day Sooner, basically, promoting One Day Sooner. And this is the part that's like highly unreplicable. It's like I stumbled across a social media post by Rob Wiblin. I read about human challenge trials in to um, accelerate the development of a COVID vaccine. This is where a person volunteers to be exposed to the pathogen in order to test vaccines more quickly. And One Day Sooner made a very compelling case that if a vaccine, I mean, basically, so it made a very compelling case because the argument went every day sooner that a vaccine is developed, you can save X thousand lives, right? This is where one day sooner, you save 10,000 lives. Now, I started volunteering with them, and challenge trials were not run in the US. The volunteering came in the form of communications primarily. So I wrote op-eds, I was interviewed about my motivation to participate in a challenge trial. I talked to other volunteers about how to sort of promote the idea and make the case. And it was really heartening to feel that even without being a doctor, a biologist, a researcher, there was something I could do. I thought if I could participate in a challenge trial, it would be the most important thing that I had ever done. And that community of volunteers, and then when One Day Sooner became, a professional organization, the staff, was a fantastic community, and just it really gave me something to. It really gave me a lot of hope to see all of these people come together in this context during this time, and was just very inspiring. I was increasing my engagement with One Day Sooner, and when it came time to sort of decide whether I would, move to Germany, try to pursue the PhD further or not, I had just reached the end of my master's degree, and a communications role opened up at One Day Sooner, and I applied for that. At the time, I thought I would do that for a year, and then I could apply to the PhD program in Germany. That, of course, obviously did not happen. I was working as the communications lead at One Day Sooner for the course of that year. And it just continued to be a great environment. My colleagues are fantastic. I think, can't speak highly enough of just the team at One Day Sooner. And that's obviously very motivating to have a team like that around you and to see people working to improve the world this way every day. And I stayed, of course. And my role was evolving quite a bit. I was actually not thrilled with many of the tasks involved in being the communications lead. I had gotten more interested in sort of project management and research, and was focusing increasingly on those areas of my job, basically to some degree to the detriment of some of the communications, the more like specific communications activities. And I think, again, it's a point where you get sort of lucky, right? Where my manager was like, well, this just seems like what you're more interested in. Can we maybe reshape your role? We'll hire somebody else to do the communications work, and draft a job description and come back to me. And I think it's sort of this just like, continued lucky breaks in some sense, where that was a generous thing to do, right? So at that point, I became a project manager. Strategic projects lead was the name of this completely invented position. And from that point, it was just, what comes up. When we had the opportunity to work on, so basically the indoor air quality specifically arose from, everything ties back to challenge trials somehow, right? Even though challenge trials for COVID were not run in the US. And I will say, we got very lucky with the vaccines that were developed. COVID challenge trials did not accelerate vaccine development because they didn't have to. We had excellent vaccines. We did not, we couldn't have known that when One Day Sooner got started. But the concept of challenge trials being useful for developing vaccines and for other research was still a really, really salient concept. So we began investigating flu challenge trials for the purposes of understanding flu transmission. Spoke to researchers, particularly at the University of Maryland, in order to understand flu challenge trials and how they might improve lives, not through developing a vaccine, but through assessing best practices, assessing built environments, and the other factors that go into flu transmission. And through that, the overarching, by now sprawling indoor air quality project was born.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't realize it was born out of that vein of research around human challenge trials. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, yeah, I guess this is a good point then to sort of ask you what indoor air quality is and why should people be caring about it, and why, yeah, what do you hope to achieve by doing these improvements to indoor air quality, and attempting these challenge trials, and what can sort of be learned from that?
So indoor air quality is, I will specify, we focus on indoor air quality for reduction in pathogen transmission. You can also focus on indoor air quality for reduction in harmful chemicals or particulate matter in the environment, and you'd want to use different interventions there. So when I say indoor air quality for the rest of this interview, it's shorthand for indoor air quality for pathogen transmission, reduction in pathogen transmission. When you say what is it? Indoor air quality can maybe be thought of as indoor air cleaning. So we are all breathing pathogens out much of the time. And as we do that, the pathogens can reach other people in our vicinity, and infect them. So there's, of course, going to be differences in how much of any given pathogen, how important the airborne transmission route is. So some pathogens are, not at all airborne, such as cholera, in the famous example of, you know, finding that cholera comes, is waterborne. And there's the famous epidemiological, like maybe I hear it sometimes called the first, the first epidemiological case study, where the researcher takes the handle off the one contaminated water pump and people stop getting cholera. So that's source control, which is relatively easier for waterborne, foodborne, that sort of pathogen. But many of the pathogens that infect us the most often are, breathed out. Source control is very difficult because, of course, you don't know who has what, and it is any attempt to obstruct your breath is going to be pretty uncomfortable. People don't like wearing masks, right? So the next step is the air quality of the room that you're in, and removing pathogens or deactivating the pathogens. You can, either physically removing pathogens from the air or deactivating the pathogens in the air, so that they can't infect other people in the room.
Right. So kind of filtering them out in the same way that you would filter out bacteria in water or particulates in water using water filters, or deactivating them by effectively killing the organic part of them that would actually result in a infection if it were to get into another host's body.
Right, exactly.
So my impression of indoor air quality focusing on pathogen transmission reduction, my impression is that that's a relatively new field, in the sense that it's gained a lot more attention since the COVID-19 pandemic. In comparison to just indoor air quality in general, if you're talking about reducing particulates or reducing chemicals, my impression is that consideration around that's been around for a while. So are you able to sort of give a high-level overview of the current state of the indoor air quality field as it pertains to pathogen transmission?
Sure. This is something that is actually pretty unusual about indoor air quality for pathogen transmission, is that first you have to recognize how much of how many pathogens are transmitted through the air and how important that route of transmission is. And the challenge there is that that's a very difficult thing to study. So we saw during the COVID pandemic that it was just not widely accepted for a very long time by scientific consensus. The scientific consensus was not on the side of airborne transmission, I would say, past the point that it was reasonable to ignore airborne routes. There's some measure of sort of caution there. There's some degree to which this is my understand. I am not a biologist, but my understanding is that this reluctance partly comes as a result of how difficult it is to measure the amount of airborne pathogen transmission. There are so many complicating factors in assessing airborne pathogen transmission in the real world where people are moving around from environment to environment. Now, like I said, I think it took longer than it needed to. There were certainly studies that ought to have convinced us much, much earlier than became widely accepted that COVID was transmitted through the air. But basically, you are looking to capture air samples and analyze those air samples for, infectious live virus, and then understand how much of it is needed to infect a person. And this is something that is estimated through what's called the quantum of infection, but it's not known with precision because of the way it interacts with, immunology, right? And that, any given pathogen can differ from any other pathogen in the amount of it that you need to take in to have the disease, right? To experience symptoms, and then to become infectious yourself. So there's this challenge around what is difficult to measure is difficult to discuss, or is difficult to advocate for, and is difficult to address.
It helps me understand why, there was so much confusion around sort of the route of transmission, because that makes it makes sense from a scientific standpoint why there was some amount of lag between people suspecting and detecting early signs of transmission through air, and then the scientific consensus just sort of swinging around to that perspective as well, just because of the uncertainty involved in measuring the number of pathogens in the air, measuring how many actually make it to another host through the air, and then what that dosage of pathogen, or the quantum, I think you said it was called, what quantum is actually required to then infect them. And there's just like each of those steps probably has really high error bars on it, or large error bars on it. And although from what you're saying, like the scientific consensus probably could have come around sooner, but I can see why it would have taken a bit of time.
I would just add that it's not necessarily, this was also somewhat COVID specific, because as long as a disease was sort of most obviously transmitted through the air, then there was widespread acceptance of it being an airborne disease. So tuberculosis is accurately categorized as an airborne disease. and measles, which is one of these tuberculosis and measles are some of the pathogens that many of the UV studies have been performed on. And actually, the earliest study I'm aware of real world use of germicidal ultraviolet light was a study on reducing transmission of measles.
Interesting. Okay. So, given that the consensus is now sort of shifted towards COVID being an airborne pathogen, what's the current state of the indoor air quality field now? Like, what level of interest is there around it, and sort of what is the current research going on in the field?
There's increasing interest in understanding the airborne component of more diseases. So we know that flu does spread through droplets, but there's also going to be an airborne component of it. We don't know how important each route of transmission is. So some studies are sort of beginning to look into this. This would be Don Milton's EMIT2 study at the University of Maryland and he's one of the researchers whose work we've relied upon very heavily over the time that we've been working on this. So that type of study is investigating flu and flu routes of transmission. Other research is on the modeling side and understanding sort of air currents through a building and how they carry pathogens from point to point. So Shelley Miller, an engineer at the University of Colorado, has a detailed modeling paper that illustrates the carriage of air and therefore infectious pathogens from point to point in a building. And we're getting more interested in more real world studies. So there have been real world studies performed. So the real world measles study that I referenced to you before was performed in 1941. So there were some follow-up studies, and we're interested in actually seeing more of that type of research at this point, where you would install some intervention and assess the impact of that intervention in an environment that people actually, that has high occupancy, right, and that people are genuinely spending their time in. The 1941 study was performed in a school. And it would be great to have comparisons of different interventions across different environments, schools, offices, restaurants, just gyms, all sorts of places. Another fairly old early study was from a tuberculosis ward, and I think TB clinics would be an incredible use case for really strong indoor air quality interventions. So there's many different, branching paths of research at this point.
Yeah, interesting. Are you able to take me through what the different technologies or interventions are, and kind of what, I guess, the pros and cons of each typically are in sort of their general use case?
Yeah. So general use case is a great question. I would say the main categories are, let's call them ventilation, filtration, and disinfection. Disinfection being primarily through germicidal ultraviolet light. So ventilation is very straightforward. This can be opening a window, or it can be mechanical ventilation, as in any building that has sort of a central, either a central HVAC system, or you can install window units that do the mechanical ventilation. So a challenge there is that mechanical ventilation, opening a window has limited use cases, although it is excellent for just bringing in fresh air. And ventilation is very challenging to upgrade to a high air turnover. So you've installed your HVAC system, you can't do that much to it if you're, want your building to be usable continuously, right?
And by that, do you mean you can't really like upgrade it further to produce more air changeovers or add extra filtration just because it's designed to meet a certain specification and that's basically what it runs at? And if you wanted to do more, you would have to replace it with something more powerful or with a higher flow rate or something like that.
Right, basically. So if you want to upgrade your, central mechanical ventilation system, you're talking about gutting a building for the most part. You can install extra filters, but extra filters are cause pressure drop. And so there's actually just a hard cap on air turnover if you're not, you know, widening your ducts and all of that sort of thing. Um, So that's a difficulty with mechanical ventilation through the central system. Window units provide some extra air turnover, but not not a lot. The other problem of ventilation is the heating and cooling of the air, the adjusting the indoor climate, and so that gets very expensive. And if you're not using energy recovery ventilation, very, very energy intensive. So any building trying to meet green standards is not it's not the best idea to try to address pathogen transmission specifically by just upgrading your ventilation. So ventilation isn't necessarily the solution to ending flu transmission, ending TB transmission, but it is really important for getting particulates and sort of the sorts of chemicals in your indoor air that are coming out of your furniture and paint and whatever out of the building, right? Um, Naturally, this also means that ventilation is going to be healthier in less polluted outdoor if the outdoor environment is less polluted, right? So ventilation does have this air exchange problem. If you're in a very polluted outdoor environment, then you're bringing that pollution right back into your building. But basically, ventilation is great. You just can't rely on it alone. Um, Filtration is another important component of cleaning your air where you can, as I said, you can install it. Ventilation systems, mechanical ventilation systems will have filters installed as a matter of course. So a way to upgrade your filtration in your room is portable air cleaners. So these are just going to be the HEPA filters that you can buy and like put each one in a room. You need a lot of them. They are less energy efficient and more noisy than germicidal ultraviolet light. So this is some drawback, but again, filters address particulates and certain chemicals that GUV would not address. Fairly straightforward.
While also addressing pathogens as well.
Yes, it does. So filtration does address pathogens as well. So GUV is going to be the sort of at the opposite end of that trade-off, where you are basically only addressing pathogens, but you're doing so extremely efficiently. So if you want to get the highest quality indoor air in all respects, removing particulate matter, removing, volatile organic compounds from your air, and also removing pathogens, some combination of GUV and filtration is going to be a pretty good, I should say, is going to be an excellent combination.
Right. So from going from like a indoor environment where you've got maybe just a window open or mechanical filtration, mechanical ventilation, to then adding like a HEPA filter filtration unit and also germicidal ultraviolet light, what sort of, I guess, magnitude of improvement in the air are we talking about there?
Um, that's a great question because I think, you know, there's an answer from possibly chamber studies for GUV, but it is actually real world data is significantly more sparse. For and all of this, I would sort of indicate point to the One Day Sooner Rethink Priorities report that has a lot of this information in it. If people want to read more details, but basically, for typically for most buildings, ventilation, as I said, there's a drop off effect with how effectively you can ventilate. In the U.S., most buildings, you can only ventilate up to 6 air changes per hour, and most of them, that would be optimal. Most of them are definitely not there, right?
Right. And so here, air changes an hour are basically the number of times the volume of air in a room is replaced with air that wasn't in the room already. So bringing in fresh air, basically, and doing that 6 times over on average in an hour. Is that a sort of good definition of that?
Yes, but most buildings are not ventilated that way. Your home might be ventilated. So a typical American home might be ventilated to zero point 0.5 air changes an hour. You're turning over the entire air of your house once every 2 hours. Filtration is partly a function of how many filters you want in a room. And you have to just spec the number of filters for the size of the space. So this is true of both any in-room intervention, both in terms of filtration and UV, would need to be spec'd for the size of the space. So it's a little bit less of a clear-cut answer. It's less about the building itself. But basically, you can think that your HEPA filter in a single filter in a correctly sized room might be turning over the air 5 times in an hour potentially. And if you want more than that, it gets louder and much more expensive. With UV light, there's the added challenge that different pathogens respond differently. So when we're talking about indoor air quality for pathogen control, equivalent air changes per hour is not necessarily providing the full picture, because it would be different if you measure the same lamp against COVID versus against TB, SARS-CoV-2 versus the tuberculosis bacterium. And on top of that, we have the added difficulty of the main way to test this so far has just been chamber studies. So on the low end, let's say, we can potentially say that a low end estimate is that correctly spec'd GUV can give you 20 equivalent air changes per hour. And correctly spec'd at the upper end might be 100. But again, this is in a chamber.
Right. And so a chamber study is like research setting, just a room, and I guess like it's the ideal, optimal sort of environment to
Exactly.
be testing. And yeah, the degree to which this translates to a real world application is maybe still up for question because there aren't that many real world studies being done at the moment.
Exactly. It is not something that I don't want to go around telling people that UV, equivalently changes over your air 100 times an hour, but it gives you a sense of the efficiency versus other options.
Right. Yeah. And also, I guess it's equivalently changing the error of up to 100 times from the metric of the pathogen concentration in that air.
Correct.
And so, like, from the metric of particulates or certain chemicals, that may not actually be, well, that won't be the case. It won't actually do effective changeovers for those metrics.
Right. It would not change that over. And in fact, would ionize some of those compounds, which is why whenever you are installing GUV, you would also need to have filtration for that room.
So GUV and I guess HEPA filter filtration go hand in hand in installation.
Yeah, they would be complementary.
Right. And I guess it kind of seems like a nice pairing as well, because GUV gets rid of pathogens really well. HEPA filters get rid of pathogens okay, but also do the chemicals and the particulates as well.
Exactly.
Are there any combinations or any sort of particular technologies that you are most excited about for future improvements?
I mean, I would love to see, I think there are challenges around many aspects of UV that I would love to see R&D advancement. So a couple of types of GUV are used. There's upper room, which is typically 254 nanometer light, which humans can't be exposed to. It's like getting sunburn, right? And 222 nanometer, which our best evidence says it is safe for human exposure, but we don't have such a wide range of people that have used it yet. And so there are questions about sort of the like broadest possible applicability of 222. Now, the difficulty with upper room UV is that it has to be installed in a configuration that protects the people in the room from the light. So 222 has the potential to be a much better consumer product because you don't have to have a specific technician with specific training install it, right? That being said, we do need to better understand widespread applicability of 222. Upper room, by contrast, is much better understood for wide applicability, mostly because the intention behind 254 upper room is that people just won't be exposed to it directly. But of course, then you're limited by the number of people who are qualified to install it, which at the moment is very low. So it is hard to commercialize much more widely than it already is. So some progress. So there are many avenues of progress I'd be excited about. One would be GUV lamps of either type that sort of come with the filter, with the in-room filter, so that when you buy your product, it's all in one neat package that you're getting filtration and GUV at the same time. Another R&D development I would be excited about would be just easier to install, harder to mess up upper room lamps. Another direction would be greater proof for the 222 lamps. This is this is more on the pure research side and less on the development side. I think there's also a lot of directions to go with increasing the availability of types of lamps. So just very limited consumer products on the market right now. Some of this is like the limited field means that a lot of companies that are selling to consumers are bottlenecked by, like who holds the patent on the emitter. So there's, a strong floor price. So just creating more types of emitters would be very exciting. I know there's been some research in the direction of solid state emitters. So currently 222 is output by emitters that are produced by krypton chloride. And it emits in a wide spectrum, most of which you have to filter out. And solid state emitters like LEDs, you would be able to just pick your wavelength and not have to filter the majority of what you're getting out of that emitter. High quality solid state emitters are just a difficult engineering problem, right? There's crystal alignment issues in there, and you can really imagine the potential for a much wider consumer market once those are solved. So I think there's a lot of directions that the ultraviolet market and research and development efforts should go.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's a bit of a spectrum of work that needs to be done on things that are sort of, the technology already exists. So the upper room, there is some R&D to be done and some more commercial side things and consumer facing things that could be done to increase adoption. But then on the 222 far UVC, there is just some more fundamental things that need to be done. So there's kind of, I guess, a broad range of interventions there that, if engineers in particular are looking to get involved, they can kind of potentially pick where on that spectrum they'd like to be involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess, speaking of trying to get more people involved in indoor air quality interventions, are you able to take me through what the Safe Air Research Alliance is and what you're hoping to achieve with it?
Absolutely. So this is currently a One Day Sooner project in collaboration with partners that is our effort to increase adoption of indoor air cleaning technologies through a market shaping and research coalition. So the basic concept is that we have to just start trying things. We have to just, in order to get the information about how cleaning your air impacts disease transmission across a wider population, we have to just install more interventions. A central challenge of this is that the person or the party, the organization that puts up the investment does not necessarily internalize all the benefits of that investment. If you are an office manager and you spend a lot on cleaning your indoor air, your staff can still go get sick somewhere else. So there's this question of how to widen the circle of adoption in such a way that people really understand and get excited about indoor air cleaning. And this is a public good, right? We don't think about this that much. I think there's been a real sort of cultural block in terms of thinking of air as something that we actually are empowered to achieve clean air the same way we've achieved clean water. And I really want people to get excited about having clean indoor air. And part of this comes from demonstrating the usefulness to the person or the parties who are actually putting in the effort to know what best cleans their air, and having them benefit and their whole community benefit. So the way this is structured is that the Safe Air Research Alliance is intended to be a coalition of researchers and host organizations, where the organizations adopt indoor air cleaning technology and allow researchers to collect data on transmission in those environments. Say, we installed this intervention, here's how transmission was affected in your environment. And at the same time, these researchers, so one issue with clean air research up until this point has been studies are very disjointed. They don't, they don't fill in each other's gaps. We often retread the same ground in research. And this is a problem when your research is as expensive and as difficult to conduct as indoor air research is. So the idea is for all of these researchers to have common study protocols, common database where they're putting their data, and common models that allow for the translation of protocols and data analysis techniques from one environment to the next. So it's called an adaptive platform study. It allows you to perform research on a sort of rolling basis and achieve better powered research than any single study alone can achieve. And then you can build a predictive model to say, where should we install this technology next, help target the next set of installations, and check it against the data that you've collected to understand how well that model performed and refine the model and continue moving forward with this perform the research, predict, update, perform the research, predict, update in order to see how increasing adoption across different environments affects the populations within those environments, but also at large, right? Because I think I would expect threshold effects, right? I would expect for environments, there will be, I think, certain environments that see relatively little benefit until many organizations within the same, city or neighborhood adopt these interventions. And you're getting all of this, data for different environments, and hopefully this allows you to perform analyses of which factors in these different environments and in population movements are important for targeting your interventions later down the line. This type of platform study also demonstrates a market and creates market commitments that ideally will spur investment and innovation in the clean air space in the sorts of ways that I described before to you, where there's lots of different ways that clean air technology could be improved. And part of it is just people not seeing the market yet, right? And so if you have this sort of layered adoption effort, first of all, you've already begun to demonstrate a larger market. And you can also have parties commit to, you can create the market commitment where you have different parties who, as they are joining the research alliance, they say, I would buy such and such technology if it fulfilled these goals, if it fulfilled these specs, which, provides clear incentive for investment in the technology itself. There are a lot of pieces to this. I think stronger consumer confidence activities would be important here. I think stronger communication about the fact that we even can do something about indoor air quality. As I said, empowering people to think about indoor air quality as a public good, is something they both have control over and ought to care about. All of these factors are going to be important, but the idea is this sort of predictive market shaping effort that can really, really expand clean air technology adoption.
Right. It seems like one of the maybe the most difficult aspect of this is actually getting people to join the alliance and be interested in putting in, I guess, the upfront capital required to install these different interventions.
It's an interesting question. I think that this is actually not necessarily what I anticipate. I think the coordination problem is hard. You're managing a lot of different parties that you have to get to agree to, you know, this set of protocols and that sort of thing. I think you're pointing to sort of a larger picture, which is funding more broadly. Now, there already have been many, many, many air cleaning technology purchases, right? There were COVID relief funds for schools that brought tons of air filters into schools. Many of those air filters are not particularly good. As I said, consumer confidence efforts in the space are not strong. There have already been GUV installations. There have already been significant efforts from individual scattered parties who don't talk to each other to upgrade their air quality. I think there's a lot of basically hidden knowledge floating around in this space. And so having one organization or another commit to a tech purchase, I'm less concerned about. I think that does not, I think we, given that we are already seeing tech purchases, great. It's ensuring the open communication so that we can build public knowledge, public understanding of what this technology is, what its use cases are, how effective it is. That is one major challenge, and that all kind of comes downstream sort of from who's going to fund the research.
Right. People have already been deploying capital. People have already been purchasing filters, installing GUV lights. They've been doing these things, and it's more just about pulling all those people together and actually saying, hey, like, what were the effects of this? Like, how can we measure those, or like, can we measure those? And then can we also communicate and sort of aggregate all this information to a wider audience so that people are more interested in doing these activities to improve indoor air quality?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I guess a lot of the discussion around indoor air quality seems very related to engineering. And it strikes me that engineers may be particularly well suited to doing work in the indoor air quality space just because of some of the just because of, I guess, the engineering nature of a lot of these questions of the built environment, of HVAC and air handling, and all these sorts of things. So I'm curious how your engineering background in particular has proved useful in the work that you've been doing at One Day Sooner.
Yeah. It's an interesting question because it's actually not so related immediately, right? Most of my job is writing and talking, right? And it's a very, very word heavy job. I write a lot of memos, and I just like tell people about this constantly. But I think there's a really key component of the analytical thinking that comes in. Um, I I think the sort of piecewise processing, break a problem down into its components, address each of those components, and see how the pieces fit together is something that I learned from my physics and engineering education. I have not done true engineering, you might say, since graduate school, since leaving the lab in graduate school. But it's definitely also useful to sort of speak the language a little bit. I can like read the indoor air quality papers, and it'll just like go a little faster for me than if I hadn't had that background. Is probably part of it. And there are some aspects of writing a report like the one I wrote, making our statistics epidemiology contractor sent me a model that I edited to put in that report, and I think the sort of numeric literacy allowed me to do that. But I would say really the central piece of how engineering has been applicable to my current work is the method of thinking that the physical sciences ask of you.
Yeah, I think that's a recurring point that a couple of guests on this podcast have made. It's just that ability to break down problems into its constituent parts, solve each of those parts, and then kind of bring it all together to say something about the problem, is just a valuable skill set that is taught through engineering and physical sciences. Um, do you have any thoughts around how engineers can most effectively contribute to the indoor air quality field if they are interested in moving into it?
I think if you want to continue focusing on applied engineering, and really, using those engineering skills, working as an engineer, I would say, then much of what I described is probably pretty exciting, right? This is a burgeoning field, especially in the UV area. Like, building high quality consumer products or testing existing consumer products, anything like that, is something that I would think has some really interesting sort of scientific and engineering questions behind it, and would probably be exciting to work on. So that would be, you know, optics and electronics and design for manufacturing, design for production, quality control. I think all of these are potentially very useful to the GUV field at the moment. A possibly underrated aspect of filtration adoption, of increased adoption of portable air cleaners, is the noise. And we, have seen case studies of places that installed portable air cleaners, and personnel in those environments turned them off because the noise was annoying. And this is something that one researcher we spoke to was pretty frustrated by, just from the perspective of, like, nobody really has tried to address this. It's not a given that you can't make a quieter air cleaner. So that might be something to look at, but is not something I know quite as much about, frankly. On the sort of, like, zooming out a little, slightly less applied, direct engineering would be things like understanding the built environment and assessing the impacts of air quality standards on buildings. This would require potentially, understanding cost benefit analysis, understanding, how building codes are shaped, and, the design of urban environments. I think those sorts of like bigger picture skills. Definitely modeling is a major thing for any of this, where you can sort of, modeling skills are probably useful across the board. There's just a lot of types of modeling. So you can be interested in computational fluid dynamics to understand, air transmission from person to person. You can be interested in, material science and how UV light might affect different materials. You can, I think this also plays into PPE, right? Like, how do you make a better personal protective equipment? How do you make a better mask is something that, is kind of adjacent to my field. We have friends and colleagues in the PPE field, and material science is probably a pretty exciting thing to study there at the moment. And there's a lot of modeling that goes into that. And there's going to be, like, agent-based modeling, which is people's movement through the urban environment, which, again, it is like, that's the zoomed out, that's the bigger picture, less like strictly applied engineering. But if you already love the modeling parts of engineering, then the ability to sort of understand interactions and how tweaks to those interactions change the overall transmission picture would be a really interesting thing. I actually have wished that I had a better grasp of agent-based modeling myself. So
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Kind of curious to go dive into that a little bit more myself. um, is there a top resource that you would recommend for engineers who want to learn more about indoor air quality as a field, or any particular aspects?
I think because it is such an interdisciplinary field, it's very difficult to talk about indoor air quality for pathogen control without pulling in epidemiology and immunology and all of these other aspects. So you can't talk about it in isolation. So yeah, it is still a challenge of being such a broad field. And we really tried in our report to provide the resources for the different pieces of it, right? So we do have a modeling section that points to, for example, the Shelley Miller paper I described. We do have references to the epidemiological modeling papers. So, I think like not to not to shill for myself, but like I think we have a lot of resources on the like academic paper side. I know the Lancet COVID-19 Commission has their sort of publication on built environment pathogen control. That's a good one to look at. That's a little bit. It's not an academic paper, right? It's a report that can guide sort of more public action. So that's a really good one. I know the Healthy Buildings book. Should probably find the title for you. I think the book is Healthy Buildings, Healthy People or something like that. So yeah, there's a specific book that references this. ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, recently published Standard 241 with information about infection control in the built environment. The Lancet Commission report is free. The ASHRAE Standard 241 is not free. This might make a difference. But I think those are, the One Day Rethink report has sort of like academic citations, and then there's these other resources to look at in terms of, expert assessments aimed at a, policy or public action based audience.
Fantastic. What do you wish you had invented, and why?
So, like I said, I think this is a really hard question because it is hard to imagine what background knowledge one needs in order to create something. And also, I am so impressed by so many inventions all of the time that it's not as easy to say, oh, this specific thing in my field. So I'll kind of like give you two different answers and you can decide if you use either. So, one way to think about this is like a particular technology that I just really loved learning how it worked, which was the radio. I remember I have this distinct memory of sitting in a feedback controls class in grad school, working through a basic transfer function chart. And the professor is like working, showing us all the pieces of it. This is what this does. This is what this does. And then says, this is a specific thing that you may have even had in your home at one point. Does anybody know what this is? What, like, this thing I've drawn on the blackboard, do you know what it is? And nobody knows. And he says, this is a radio. This is all you need. Like, this knowledge and some electronic components is all you need to build a radio. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. I just thought that was so unbelievable, because I really love technology that I like can understand each component of, right? That you can to some extent open it up and just see how it works. This is what drew me to physics and engineering, is the understanding how the fundamental stuff works. And I'm just really impressed by the people who invented things before we had all of this computational power at our fingertips, right? I have no particular interest in having invented the computer, which is this weird black box to me. But the radio is no longer a black box. So that's one answer. The other way to answer this is just like, what project would I have been most excited to work on, even though it's not one specific invention, which would have been the Mars rovers. I just, like, if I could have picked like when I was a kid, like the dream team to me was the people building the Mars rovers. That was like the work environment that I thought I would most want to be in. So it's not really a specific invention, but it's like, to me, that I imagined that as kind of like the pinnacle of that like collaborative creativity, you know? And now at this point, I know that there are many, many, many workplaces of collaborative creativity, but the Mars rovers like really stuck in my head.
Yeah, those are both terrific answers, I think. The Mars rover is just collaborative creativity is a great way to describe it. It just seems like engineering at the sort of the frontier of creative problem solving and teamwork as engineers. It just seems like the pinnacle of that. And then the radio, that's really cool. It is cool just being able to open something up, being able to point to the thing and be like, yeah, that does this does that. And when you put those together, you get this. And that's cool. Mm-hmm. Terrific. Well, Gavriel, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Hope it gets people interested in indoor air quality.
Yeah, me too. I think it's a really interesting field, and it's really only just getting started from what I can see.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of exciting places to go from here.
Terrific. Well, thank you.
Have a great day.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. You'll find show notes with resources related to this episode at engineeredforimpact.show/Gavriel. That's GAVRIEL. You can support the podcast by leaving us feedback on our website or sharing this episode with a friend or colleague. Thanks for listening, and happy problem solving.